My mom left me, and when she got in trouble, she came to ask for help. The day my dad died is burned into my memory, like a scar that never fades. I was only 7, so a lot of it is blurry, but certain moments feel crystal clear, as if I could reach out and touch them even now. I remember sitting at the edge of the hospital bed, clutching his hand. My dad was pale and tired, but he managed to smile when he looked at me. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, squeezing my hand as much as he could. "You gotta take care of your mom for me, okay? Promise?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "I promise, Dad." He looked at me with such kindness, his eyes soft, and then he turned to my mom. She stood at the other side of the bed, her hand covering her mouth, her whole body trembling. She was trying to be strong, but I could see how scared she was. "Laura," my dad said softly, looking at her like he was memorizing her face. "I'm sorry for everything. You're going to be okay." She didn't say anything, just nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. And then he was gone. Just like that, my whole world shifted like a picture suddenly torn in half. The house felt emptier after that day, as if something vital had been taken out of it. My mom, Laura, tried her best to keep things running smoothly, but even at 7, I could tell she was struggling. I'd hear her crying at night when she thought I was asleep. And every morning, she'd put on a brave face, pretending like everything was fine. One night, a few weeks after Dad passed, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. I crept down the hallway and peeked in, just in time to see my mom talking with my older brother, David. She was at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, and David was standing across from her, his arms crossed, his face serious. "Mom," David was saying, his voice low and firm, "I can help out. I'll work more hours. It'll be okay." My mom shook her head, looking up at him with tired eyes. "David, you're only 14. You shouldn't have to. This isn't your responsibility." David put a hand on her shoulder. "We're family, Mom. We'll figure it out." I stood in the hallway, holding my breath, feeling like I didn't belong in that room anymore. David was older, stronger, like he could take on the world if he had to. But me? I was just a kid still figuring out how to tie my shoes right half the time. Later that night, when she came into my room to tuck me in, I decided to ask her what I'd been too afraid to ask all week. "Mom?" I whispered as she sat down on the edge of my bed. "Yes, honey?" She brushed my hair back, smiling in that way she did when she was trying to hide how tired she really was. "Are we going to be okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her smile faltered just for a second, and I saw something flash in her eyes, fear, maybe, or something close to it. But then she nodded, her voice steady. "Of course we will. We're strong, aren't we?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I believed her. A few more weeks went by, and things didn't get any easier. I'd come home from school to find her at the kitchen table, staring at bills and paperwork, her face lined with worry. One afternoon, I heard her talking on the phone in the other room, her voice strained. "I just don't know how we're going to do it," she said to whoever was on the other end. "I can't afford." "No, I can't ask him to take on any more. He's only a boy." I don't know what changed after that, but one evening, as I was playing with my toys in the living room, she came in and knelt down beside me. Her face was softer than usual, but her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "Honey," she began, her voice gentle, "how would you feel about going to stay with Aunt Mary for a little while?" I looked up confused. "Why? Are we going on a trip?" She shook her head, reaching out to hold my hand. "Not a trip, sweetheart. Just Aunt Mary could take care of you for a bit. Okay? It'll just be you, not David. He's going to stay here and help me out." I blinked, not understanding. "But why can't I stay too?" She closed her eyes for a moment, then looked at me, her face full of pain. Because I need some time to figure things out. And I need you to be safe and happy. And right now, Aunt Mary can give you that." "But Mom," I whispered, clutching her hand, "I don't want to go." She pulled me into a tight hug, holding me close. "I know, honey. I know. And I know it doesn't make sense now, but you'll understand when you're older." As she hugged me, I had this sinking feeling, a terrible, hollow ache in my chest. Somehow, even though I was only 7, I knew deep down that if I left, things would never be the same. The morning I was supposed to leave for Aunt Mary's, my mom packed my little suitcase herself. I watched her fold my clothes, tucking them in carefully, almost like she was trying to make the bag as cozy as possible. She even put my favorite teddy bear on top, pressing it down as if that would keep it from bouncing around on the trip. "Mom," I whispered as she zipped up the bag, "how long do I have to stay with Aunt Mary?" She looked up at me, her face tight with sadness, but she forced a smile. "Just a little while, sweetheart. Aunt Mary is so excited to see you. You're going to have so much fun." I didn't answer, just hugged my teddy bear tighter. Somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that a little while was going to be a very long time. When Aunt Mary came to pick me up, she tried to make it feel like an adventure. She showed up in her little red car, honking cheerfully from the driveway, like we were heading off on a road trip. My mom and I walked outside, my hand in hers, and she tried to smile as we approached the car. Aunt Mary was all sunshine, her smile big and bright as she got out and pulled me into a hug. "There's my favorite little guy." Aunt Mary grinned, tousling my hair. "Are you ready to go, kiddo? I've got snacks and your favorite songs lined up." I tried to smile, but it was hard. I kept looking back at my mom, who was standing on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together. She forced a small smile, waving at me. "Be good, okay?" she called out, her voice cracking a little. "And listen to Aunt Mary." "I will, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to run back to her, hug her, and beg her to let me stay. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. As I climbed into the car, Aunt Mary turned around and gave me a gentle smile. "We're going to have a good time, kiddo. You'll see." I nodded, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't take my eyes off my mom, who was watching us with that tight, sad smile. As we pulled out of the driveway, I twisted in my seat to keep looking at her through the back window. She stood there, watching until we turned the corner, and then she was gone. The drive to Aunt Mary's house was quiet at first. Aunt Mary tried to cheer me up, putting on some music and pointing out things on the side of the road. "Look at that big tractor," she said, gesturing out the window. "Doesn't it look like a giant bug?" I gave her a small smile, but I couldn't really bring myself to answer. She must have noticed because after a while, she just let the music play softly and focused on driving. When we got to her house, Aunt Mary parked the car and turned to me with a gentle look. "I know this is hard, sweetheart, but I'm here, okay? You're not alone. You're going to be safe and loved here. I promise." I nodded, still clutching my teddy bear, and she helped me out of the car. Aunt Mary's house was warm and smelled like cinnamon, and she'd even put a little welcome sign on the front door with my name written in big, colorful letters. "Look at that," she said, grinning as she pointed to it. "I wanted to make sure you knew how happy we are to have you here. You're going to make this place even more special, kiddo." She was trying so hard to make me feel at home, but all I could think about was that I didn't belong here. My home was with my mom and David, but that wasn't really my home anymore, was it? That night, I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard the phone ring. My heart leapt. It had to be my mom. I sat up quickly, barely breathing, listening hard as Aunt Mary picked up the phone in the next room. "Hi, Laura," I heard her say softly. I hugged my teddy bear, waiting for her to call me into the room. A minute passed, then two, and I started to worry. Was my mom okay? Did something happen? I slid out of bed and crept to the doorway, peeking around the corner to see Aunt Mary on the phone. She looked up and saw me, giving me a soft smile as she held the receiver out. "It's your mom," she whispered, beckoning me over. I grabbed the phone with both hands, pressing it to my ear. "Mom?" "Oh, honey." Her voice crackled on the other end, and I could hear the sadness in it. "Are you settling in okay?" "Yeah," I said, biting my lip. "When can I come home, Mom?" There was a long pause, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "Soon, sweetheart. Just give me a little time, okay? You'll understand when you're older." I didn't understand, but I wanted to be brave, so I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, more than anything," she whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. After that, she called every day for the first few weeks. I'd wait by the phone each night, counting down the minutes until she'd call, just to hear her voice, even if only for a few minutes. But as time passed, her calls became less frequent. Sometimes she'd skip a day or two, then 3, then a whole week. Every time Aunt Mary would see me waiting by the phone, she'd give me a sad look, but wouldn't say anything. One evening, After nearly 2 weeks with no call, I finally gave up and went to bed early, feeling more alone than ever. A few days later, I heard Aunt Mary talking on the phone again. This time, her voice was quieter, almost like she was trying to keep her words from reaching me. When she hung up, she walked into my room and sat on the edge of my bed, taking my hand in hers. "Honey," she began, her face serious yet soft. "Your mom, she can't take you back anytime soon. She's got a lot she needs to figure out, and it's going to take a while. So, you're going to stay here with me just a bit longer." Something cracked inside me. I stared at her, not knowing what to say. I didn't cry, didn't say anything at all. I just sat there, holding her hand, realizing what that meant. It meant I'd been left behind. The first few days after Aunt Mary's talk, I still held on to hope that my mom would call. Each evening, I sat by the phone, waiting, convinced she'd reach out and tell me everything was fine. Aunt Mary would pass by and give me a sad smile, but I didn't say anything. I just kept waiting. One evening, Aunt Mary came into the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel. She saw me staring at the phone and sat down next to me. "Honey," she said softly, "you know you don't have to wait by the phone, right?" "But what if she calls?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "If she does, I promise I'll come get you right away," Aunt Mary said, putting her arm around me. I nodded, but didn't move. Sitting by that phone was all I had to feel connected to my mom, even if each night ended with nothing but silence. After a few weeks, I started school in Aunt Mary's neighborhood. She drove me every day, always trying to make me laugh by telling funny stories or pointing out things along the road. "You know, kiddo, I was a terrible student," she joked one morning, grinning at me in the rearview mirror. "Your Uncle John says I probably would have stayed in kindergarten forever if they hadn't dragged me out." I gave her a small smile, but it wasn't the same as my mom's jokes. Nothing was. One afternoon, after another quiet day of school, Aunt Mary handed me a small envelope. "This came in the mail today," she said, giving me a hopeful smile. It was a letter from my mom. She didn't say much, just that she missed me and hoped I was adjusting well. I read it over and over, but it only made the ache in my chest worse. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Aunt Mary asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Yeah," I said, tucking the letter into my backpack. But as I walked to my room, I realized how empty the words had felt. Just another reminder that I was really here for the long haul. Days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months. Aunt Mary's house, slowly, became my world. At first, I held on to little routines from my old life, hoping they'd bring me some comfort. But over time, it was Aunt Mary's warmth and care that really made me feel safe. One evening, she was tucking me in, pulling the covers up to my chin the way my mom used to, when she noticed me holding my teddy bear a little tighter than usual. She brushed back my hair, giving me a soft look. "You miss her a lot, don't you?" I swallowed, feeling my eyes sting. "Yeah, it feels like she forgot about me," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Aunt Mary sighed and wrapped her arms around me, pulling me close. Her hug was warm, and for the first time, I let myself really lean into it. "Oh, honey," she murmured, her voice full of sadness, but also something stronger, something that felt safe. "I know it feels that way, but you're loved more than you know. And I'm here, okay? Always, always," I asked, feeling like I needed her to say it again, to make it real. "Always," she said firmly, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." I nodded, trying to keep the tears in, but one slipped out anyway. Aunt Mary wiped it away with her thumb and then began to hum softly, a melody that I didn't recognize but felt soothing, like something she'd known forever. "What song is that?" I asked, my voice sleepy. "It's just something my mom used to hum for me when I couldn't sleep," she said, stroking my hair. "Seems to work, doesn't it?" I didn't answer, but I felt my eyes getting heavier. Aunt Mary kept humming, and that night, I finally slept without the ache in my chest feeling quite so sharp. A few weeks later, Aunt Mary sat me down at the kitchen table one Saturday morning. "Hey, kiddo," she began, glancing at me with a little smile. "I've been thinking, and I'd like you to try seeing someone. Just a nice lady to talk to about anything you want." My eyebrows scrunched up. "Like a therapist?" She nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Sometimes it helps to talk about the hard stuff. You're holding a lot inside, and I want to make sure you have someone to help you with that. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means you're carrying more than any kid should." I looked down, fiddling with the edge of my sleeve. Is it because I miss my mom?" I asked, feeling embarrassed but also wanting to know. Aunt Mary nodded, her eyes softening. "That's part of it. But it's also because I want you to be happy here. And talking can help." At first, therapy felt awkward and uncomfortable. I wasn't sure what to say, and the questions seemed too personal. But after a few sessions, I started to open up. I talked about the hurt of being left behind, the confusion of why I wasn't enough to keep my mom's attention. The therapist listened, letting me talk about things I'd been too afraid to say out loud, and gradually, it began to help. The pain didn't vanish, but I started to make sense of it a little more. Life with Aunt Mary became a comfortable routine. She cheered at every one of my soccer games, even if I only played for a few minutes, and she'd help me with projects, no matter how last minute. She even had a tradition of making ice cream sundaes on Friday nights to celebrate the end of the week. And on those days I got a good grade or won a game, she'd put out sprinkles and chocolate sauce and say, "Tonight, we're having the ultimate sundae," giving me a proud grin. One evening, after we'd cleaned up the dinner dishes, Aunt Mary called me into the kitchen while she was stirring a pot on the stove. The air was filled with the smell of something savory, and she looked up, smiling. "You know what I realized, kiddo?" she said, a little sparkle in her eyes. "What?" I asked, hopping up onto a stool by the counter. She put down her spoon and leaned over, her face full of warmth. "You're like the son I never had," she said softly. And I couldn't be prouder. Her words filled the kitchen, quiet but powerful. I felt something in me shift, like a wall I'd been holding up finally crumbled. Aunt Mary didn't just care for me out of obligation. She truly loved me, in the way a mother loves her child. I slid off the stool and hugged her tightly, burying my face in her shoulder. "Thanks, Aunt Mary," I whispered, my voice muffled but full of all the things I couldn't say. She held me just as tightly, rubbing my back. "You're so welcome, sweetheart." That night, as I got ready for bed, I felt a flicker of peace in my heart. Aunt Mary's house would never quite be my old home, but it was warm and full of love, the closest thing I'd had to a real home in a long, long time. By the time I was 12, Aunt Mary's house felt more like home than I could ever have imagined. There was always warmth here, always the steady comfort of knowing I was wanted. Sometimes I even slipped up and called her Mom. Every time it happened, I'd pause, feeling a pang of guilt, as if somehow I was betraying my real mother. But Aunt Mary never made a big deal of it. She'd just give me a little smile, her eyes soft, like she understood. Then, one spring afternoon, Aunt Mary sat me down on the couch, her face lit up with excitement. "Okay, I've got some big news," she said, barely containing her smile. She practically bounced on the edge of her seat, eyes twinkling. "What is it?" I asked, grinning just because she looked so thrilled. She took my hand, squeezing it. "Uncle John and I are getting married." My heart skipped a beat. "Really?" I asked, half in disbelief and half, well, just really happy. She laughed, a joyful sound that filled the room. "Yes, really, really." She hugged me, then leaned back, her face glowing. "And guess what? We want you to be a part of the wedding. In fact, we were hoping you'd carry the rings for us." I blinked, feeling her hand warm around mine. You want me in the wedding?" "Of course," she said softly, giving my hand another squeeze. "You're part of our family. This day wouldn't be the same without you by our side." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd always felt part of Aunt Mary's life, but to be included like this, to have her call me family in such a real way, I hadn't realized just how much it meant to me. I hugged her tightly, feeling a warmth that went right down to my bones. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of preparations. Aunt Mary would get home from work and spread out magazines and fabric swatches across the dining room table. She'd ask my opinion on everything from the color of the tablecloths to the flavor of the cake, and I loved it. She'd always look at me, seriously listening, even if my suggestions weren't exactly stylish. One evening, as she was holding up a tie she was considering for Uncle John, she asked, "So, what do you think? Too flashy?" I tilted my head, pretending to consider it carefully. "Maybe a little too sparkly?" I suggested, grinning. She burst out laughing, shaking her head. You're right. You're right. Let's go with something simpler. She leaned over and ruffled my hair. You've got good taste. It felt like we were in this together, like this wedding was about all three of us becoming a family. When the wedding day arrived, everything felt surreal. I'd never been to a wedding before, let alone been part of one. The house buzzed with excitement and nerves. Aunt Mary's friends and a few relatives flitted around, helping her with her hair and dress, and the energy was infectious. Aunt Mary was in her bedroom, adjusting her veil when I poked my head in. She turned to look at me, her face radiant. I'd never seen her look like this. She was absolutely glowing, and for the first time, I could see how much she loved Uncle John. She held out her hands, motioning me over. Come here, she whispered, taking my hands in hers. Wow, I managed staring up at her. You look like a queen or something. She laughed, her cheeks turning pink. Thank you, sweetheart. And you, Mr. Ring Bearer, look very handsome yourself. I looked down at my suit, straightening the collar. I felt both proud and a little nervous. You ready? She asked, squeezing my hands. This is a big job. We're counting on you to bring those rings up there. I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose. I won't let you down, I promise. She smiled, leaning down to kiss my forehead. I know you won't. The ceremony itself was a beautiful blur of flowers, music, and unfamiliar faces. I stood at the front, holding the rings tightly in my hands, feeling their weight as if it symbolized something much bigger than a piece of jewelry. Aunt Mary, my mom really, and Uncle John looked so happy standing side by side. Watching them, I realized this wasn't just a wedding. It was the start of our life together, as a real family. When my cue came, I walked carefully down the aisle, holding the rings as if they were the most precious things in the world. I handed them to Uncle John, who gave me a small wink and whispered, Good job, kiddo. I grinned back, my chest swelling with pride. After the vows, when Aunt Mary and Uncle John kissed, everyone cheered, and I felt this huge wave of happiness wash over me. I was part of something real, something solid. I looked around, feeling like I belonged here in this moment. After the ceremony, Aunt Mary found me among the guests. She pulled me into a big hug, her eyes shining with happy tears. Thank you, sweetheart, she whispered, holding me tightly. You were perfect. I hugged her back, feeling my heart settle into a calm, steady rhythm. I'm so happy for you, Aunt Mary, I whispered, and as the words left my mouth, I realized I meant it with every part of me. As I looked around at the sea of smiling faces, my eyes drifted to the empty seats where my mom and David would have been. They hadn't come. They hadn't even called. And yet somehow, the ache in my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I looked back at Aunt Mary, and in that moment, I let the hope of my old family go. I let go of waiting for a call, a letter, any sign that they'd come back for me. They were gone, but Aunt Mary, Uncle John, they were here. And they were my family now. That day, I finally felt free. Years went by, and by the time I was in college, my old life felt like a distant dream. Aunt Mary and Uncle John were my mom and dad now. My birth mother and David. They were almost like memories of a story I'd read rather than real people. Aunt Mary's home had become my home, and I hadn't felt that hollow ache in my chest in a long time. Then one spring evening, I was at my apartment studying when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, and I hesitated, almost ignoring it. But something stopped me, a strange instinct that made me pick up. Hello, I said cautiously, bracing myself. There was a shaky breath on the other end, then a voice that was painfully familiar, but older, strained, and almost unrecognizable. Hi, it's me. I froze. Mom? Yes, honey, it's me. Her voice was thin and trembled a little. There was no warmth in it, only something fragile and almost broken. I wanted to see you. Could we meet? Silence hung between us. I could feel old wounds itching to reopen, memories flooding back. Part of me wanted to hang up right there, but another part of me felt this pull, a need to understand why she'd been gone for so long. Finally, I spoke. All right, I said quietly. Let's meet. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in town. I arrived a few minutes early, sitting at a table by the window, feeling a strange mix of calm and nerves. As I stared out, watching people walk by, I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I'd imagined seeing her again so many times, but now that it was actually happening, I didn't know what to feel. When she finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She was thinner, her face drawn and tired, with dark circles under her eyes. She wore a coat that seemed too big for her, as if she'd shrunk inside it. Our eyes met, and she gave me a tentative smile. "Oh, honey," she whispered, pausing as if to let herself take me in. She reached out for a hug, but I stayed seated, my hands resting stiffly on the table. "I said simply, giving her a nod to sit down. She hesitated, her smile fading a little, but then she took the seat across from me. She folded her hands on the table, and for a moment, we just sat there, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You look so grown up," she said, her voice filled with a strange, hesitant pride. "I can't believe it's really you." I forced myself to look her in the eyes. "Yeah, a lot of time has passed." She flinched slightly, and I could see the hurt in her face. But she nodded, as if she knew she deserved it. I know I haven't been there, and I know you probably don't understand, but I thought you were doing okay with Aunt Mary." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you here, Mom? Why now?" She bit her lip, glancing down at her hands, and I noticed they were trembling slightly. It's David," she said, her voice breaking a little. He convinced me to take out a loan for a business idea. He said it would change everything for us." I trusted him, but it was a scam. And now, I'm left with a huge debt." Her eyes were filling with tears as she looked up at me. I was hoping you could help me, honey." I didn't know where else to turn. I stared at her, feeling as if someone had just poured ice water over me. I could barely process what she was saying. All I knew was that she hadn't come back for me. She'd come back because she needed something. "So, that's why you wanted to see me?" I asked slowly, feeling a strange numbness take over. "Because you need money?" Her face crumpled, and she looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "It's not just that," she whispered. "We're still family." I thought maybe you could forgive me. I've been through so much, and I'm so tired, honey. I know I wasn't there for you, but can we put all that behind us? Start over?" I felt years of hurt and anger rise up inside me. She wanted forgiveness, but she wasn't offering any kind of apology. She wasn't even acknowledging what she'd done, not really. She just wanted to brush it all under the rug, as if those years of abandonment could be erased with a single request for help. "Why should I help you?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "You were the one who left me. You chose David. You abandoned me." She flinched again, her face turning pale. I didn't have a choice. It was so hard, and I thought you were doing well with Aunt Mary. I thought you'd understand." "Understand?" I repeated, disbelief and anger swirling together inside me. "You left me. You didn't even try to come back for me. Not once." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, ashamed. She didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself. Part of me wanted her to at least fight for her choices, to give me some reason, any reason that would explain why she'd chosen David over me. Instead, she simply sat there, defeated, her hands wringing together in her lap. I realized in that moment that I was never going to get the apology I needed. She wasn't capable of giving it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Fine," I said, my voice cold and even. "I'll help you, but only on one condition." She looked up, her face a mixture of hope and dread. "What is it?" I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving hers. "You apologize publicly for abandoning me. You admit that you chose David over me because you loved him more. You tell the truth to everyone." Her face went pale, and she sat back, stunned. I could see in her eyes that this was too much for her, that her pride would never let her admit what she'd done. I can't do that," she whispered, shaking her head, a single tear sliding down her cheek. That's too much, honey." I nodded, standing up and grabbing my coat. "Then we have nothing more to say to each other." She watched me, her eyes wide with shock and hurt, but she didn't try to stop me. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding, feeling both hollow and strangely free. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I realized that I'd just closed a door I'd been waiting years to shut. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. A few days after my encounter with my mother, Aunt Mary called me. Her voice was calm, but with a hint of something else I couldn't quite place. "So, I heard you met with your mom," she began, carefully. I took a deep breath. Yeah, she needed help, and I told her I'd do it, but only if she'd admit that she abandoned me. Aunt Mary was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her tone was softer. "And do you really think that's going to bring you peace?" "I don't know," I replied, feeling a twinge of uncertainty. But it felt like it was my only way to make her understand what she did. "Honey," Aunt Mary said gently, "I understand why you feel that way, and I can't imagine the hurt you've held onto all these years. But sometimes, making someone suffer doesn't actually heal anything in us. You don't have to forgive her, but don't let this bitterness weigh you down. You've got so much of your life ahead of you." I sat there, her words sinking in. Aunt Mary was the only person who could say something like that to me, and somehow, she always seemed to know just what I needed to hear. "I know you're right, Aunt Mary," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I just wanted her to see how much it hurt." She sighed, the compassion in her voice warming me through the phone. "Sometimes people can't see, no matter how much we want them to. You're stronger than you realize, though. I just don't want you to let this hurt keep defining you." That night, I lay awake, thinking about what Aunt Mary had said. Her words stuck with me, bringing up memories I'd buried long ago. Those lonely nights waiting for my mom to call, the painful realization that I'd been left behind. Part of me wanted to let go, to take Aunt Mary's advice and move on. But another part held tight to the hurt, as if letting it go would mean accepting that I'd never get the apology I needed. I knew Aunt Mary was right, though. My mother might never admit the truth, and I had to find a way to live with that. Weeks passed, and I threw myself back into my life, focusing on school and the future I'd worked so hard to build. Aunt Mary's words had lingered, helping me push forward, even if I hadn't fully let go of the bitterness I held for my mom. Then, one evening, as I was finishing up a paper, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, seeing my mother's number. I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to answer. But something told me to pick up. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Honey, I need your help," she whispered, her voice more desperate than I'd ever heard it. There was a tremble in her words that felt different this time, something beyond financial trouble. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. It's David," she said, barely able to get the words out. He's been arrested. They say it's for drug trafficking. I don't know what to do." I took a slow breath, trying to process this new bombshell. "And why are you calling me?" "Because you're the only one who can help," she said, the desperation in her voice sharp and raw. "I thought maybe you could help us pay for a lawyer. Please do it for the memory of your father. He wouldn't have wanted us to be so broken apart." Her words stung, and a long silence settled between us. For a moment, I thought back to my father and what he might have thought of this mess. But then I remembered all those years of being left behind, of waiting for calls that never came, of carrying pain alone. I took a deep breath and spoke quietly, but firmly. "No, Mom, I can't help. Not anymore." She started to sob on the other end, but I stayed silent, letting her realize that this time, I wasn't coming to her rescue. "Please, honey," she choked out one last time. "We're still family." "No, we're not," I replied, feeling the weight of those words settle over me. "You left me behind a long time ago. I have my family now, and it's not you and David." I hung up, feeling a strange, bittersweet calm wash over me. In that moment, I knew I was finally free from her, from David, from the past. They had chosen their paths, and now I was choosing mine. A few days after that final call with my mother, Aunt Mary invited me over for dinner. As I sat at the kitchen table, watching her cook, I felt the weight of everything I'd been through. The years of silence, the recent calls from my mom, and the choice I'd made to finally let them go. Aunt Mary seemed to sense something on my mind. She turned, drying her hands on a towel and giving me a knowing look. "All right," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Spill it. You've been quiet all night." I hesitated, then finally let it all out. "Mom called me again. She asked me to help David, to pay for his lawyer." I took a shaky breath. I told her no. Aunt Mary nodded, listening closely, her face softening. "That must have been hard, honey." "It was, but it also wasn't," I admitted, surprised by how easy it was to be honest with her. "I thought I'd feel guilty or regret it, but I don't. I feel relieved, like I finally let go." Aunt Mary came over, sitting beside me at the table. "You know," she began, reaching for my hand, "sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about the people who are there for you, who choose you every day." She paused, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. "And you'll always have that with me and John." A lump formed in my throat, and I looked down, trying to blink back tears. "I know, and I feel so lucky. I just never thought I'd have to walk away from my mom to feel free." Aunt Mary hugged me, wrapping me in her warmth. "You did what you had to do to protect yourself," she whispered. "I'm proud of you for that." For the first time, I felt the full weight of her words. In all these years, Aunt Mary had been there, filling the emptiness left by my mother and standing beside me as my true family. As I hugged her back, I felt something inside me finally release, the last of the bitterness, the anger, and the lingering hurt. With Aunt Mary's support, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I'd finally cut ties with my past and accepted that the family I needed had been right beside me all along. Aunt Mary and Uncle John were the ones who had loved me, guided me, and celebrated every milestone in my life. I felt ready, for the first time, to leave the past where it belonged. A few months later, I stood on the porch of Aunt Mary and Uncle John's house, looking out at the sunset while they finished setting up the table for a small family gathering. It was nothing fancy, just a backyard dinner with a few close friends and family members. Aunt Mary caught my eye through the window and grinned, waving me inside. As we sat around the table that night, laughter filled the air. Uncle John was sharing a story from when he first started dating Aunt Mary, making everyone laugh as he exaggerated the details. I looked around at the people gathered, realizing that this was my family. These were the people who had been there for me no matter what. When the laughter died down, Aunt Mary reached across the table to pour me another glass of lemonade. "You look like you're a million miles away," she teased, giving me a gentle nudge. I smiled, shaking my head. "No, I'm right where I need to be," I replied, meaning every word. Uncle John raised his glass, calling for a toast. "To family, by choice and by love," he said, his eyes twinkling as he looked at me and Aunt Mary. "To family," I echoed, clinking my glass with everyone else's. In that moment, I realized just how much I had gained. My mother and brother might have drifted out of my life, but Aunt Mary and Uncle John had given me something I could never have expected: a family built on love, acceptance, and unbreakable bonds. As the evening wound down, Aunt Mary pulled me aside, her eyes filled with pride. "You've come a long way, you know that?" she said, wrapping me in a hug. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, feeling a warmth fill me from within. In the quiet that followed, I understood that I was finally at peace. The scars of the past were still there, but they didn't hurt like they used to. I had found my home, my family, and a life that felt whole. And from that day forward, I lived fully in the present, grateful for every single moment.